Please don't touch him, ma'am. Janice Morgan's voice stopped the ballroom cold. Every crystal glass in the room seemed to fall silent at exactly the same moment. The elegantly dressed socialite froze mid-swing, her raised hand trembling with fury, her eyes snapping toward the woman who had dared to interrupt her. The little boy, 7 years old, drowning in an oversized jacket, pressed himself backward, his whole body shaking. Janice stepped directly between them. Not to the side, not halfway, directly between them, so that the socialite would have to go through her first. "Respectfully, ma'am," Janice said, her voice still terrifyingly calm. "No guest status gives them the right to lay a hand on a child." The socialite's face twisted. "Do you know who I am?" "I do," Janice replied, "and it doesn't change what I just said." The room was completely still. Someone's phone was already recording. The socialite turned a deep, ugly shade of crimson and screamed for security, and within 30 seconds the acting general manager came speed-walking across the marble floor, his eyes scanning the frozen crowd with barely concealed panic. He looked at the little boy, he looked at the socialite, then he looked at Janice. And Janice watched him make his decision in real time. "Whose child is this?" he snapped, glaring at the crowd. From the very back of the room, a small voice answered. Minji, the night shift room attendant, stepped forward with her head already bowed so low her chin nearly touched her chest. She was bowing and apologizing before she even finished walking, her whole body trembling. The boy was her son, Minjun. Her childcare had fallen through without warning. She had no one else. She hadn't known what else to do. The acting GM didn't ask a single question. He didn't speak to a single witness. He turned to Janice with the flat, practiced calm of a man who had made this kind of calculation 1,000 times before. "Miss Morgan, you are dismissed, effective immediately." The word landed like a stone dropped into still water. Janice didn't move. She didn't flinch. She didn't beg. She reached up, unpinned her staff badge, and set it on the marble reception desk with a quiet, deliberate click that somehow echoed louder than anything the socialite had said. Then she turned, crouched slightly, and looked directly at Minjun, whose tears were still streaming silently down his small face. "It's okay, Minjun," she whispered. "You're safe." She stood. She walked out. And the acting general manager turned to the socialite with a practiced smile and said, "On behalf of the hotel, I sincerely apologize for this disruption." Before we go any further, if you're already feeling something watching this woman walk out of that ballroom with her head high and her hands steady, you're exactly where this story needs you to be. Subscribe to this channel right now, hit the like button, and drop a comment telling us where in the world you're watching from. Because what happens next is something nobody in that ballroom saw coming. Not the socialite, not the GM, not even Janice herself. 4 floors above the ballroom, in a private security room that didn't appear on any guest-facing map of the hotel, a man sat in front of a wall of 4K monitors and watched the entire thing unfold in silence. Kang Ji-hoon was 29 years old. Publicly, he was the chairman of Korea's most prestigious luxury hotel group, a title he had inherited young and grown into fast. Privately, he was something else entirely, something that powerful men in Seoul whispered about in careful voices and never said directly. His right-hand man, Seo, stood just behind his left shoulder, and both of them had watched every second of what just happened in the ballroom below. Ji-hoon didn't speak immediately. He reached forward, rewound the footage, and played it again. Then again. His eyes never left the screen. "Who is she?" he finally said. Seo didn't answer right away. Not because he didn't know. He had already pulled her file the moment she stepped between that woman and that child. He waited because he had worked beside Ji-hoon long enough to understand that when the chairman asked a question in that particular tone of voice, he wasn't really asking for basic information. He was asking for something deeper. "Janice Morgan," Seo said. "American. Hospitality management background. Been with this property for 6 years. Not a single disciplinary record." Ji-hoon's eyes stayed on the screen. "Promotion history?" Seo set the folder on the desk. "Recommended for guest relations manager twice. Denied both times by the acting GM." The room was quiet for a long moment. Ji-hoon's phone buzzed. He glanced at it once. The ballroom video had already gone viral, and the socialite's family, one of the wealthiest in the country, was already calling the hotel's PR department, demanding a statement that would permanently destroy Janice Morgan's professional reputation before she could tell her side of the story. Ji-hoon set the phone face down on the desk. "Tell PR to hold," he said quietly. "Find out where she goes, and make sure our legal team is ready." Seo looked at him for just a moment longer than necessary. Then he nodded and walked out. And Ji-hoon turned back to the monitors, where the empty ballroom was already being reset by the night staff, the crystal glasses collected, the marble floor polished, every visible trace of what had happened carefully erased. And he sat there alone in the blue light of the screens, watching a woman who had already left the building. Janice Morgan's apartment in Seoul was quiet in the way that only a person living alone truly understands. A silence that has texture, weight, and memory pressed into every corner of it. She had decorated it herself over 6 years, a careful arrangement of things that mattered, framed professional certifications in Korean language and hospitality management, a small collection of well-read books on organizational leadership and global culture, a single photograph of her mother on the kitchen windowsill. She wasn't crying. That surprised even her. She sat at her kitchen table with her hands wrapped around a cup of tea that had gone cold, and she stared at the document in front of her with a stillness that was almost eerie. Her E7 visa. In South Korea, that visa was not hers. Not really. It belonged to her employer. The moment she was fired, a legal clock had started running inside it, quiet and invisible and merciless. 30 days. She had 30 days to find a new executive-level sponsor or face mandatory departure. 6 years of building a life in this country. 6 years of studying the language, memorizing the customs, earning the trust of guests and junior staff alike. 30 days. Her phone was silent. She had already noticed, without looking directly, that her name had vanished from the staff group chats. Not removed dramatically, just quietly gone, the way a name disappears from a conversation that has already moved on. She put the phone face down. She had protected that child because it was simply the right thing to do. She knew that with her whole self. But sitting in that quiet apartment, with a visa clock running and a phone full of silence, Janice Morgan made herself a promise that felt like swallowing something sharp. She was done playing the hero, done risking everything she had built for people who would not risk a single thing for her. From now on, she would keep her head down, do her work, and let the world be exactly as cruel as it had always been. She almost believed herself. Then her phone buzzed. A text from Minji, the housekeeper. Just 4 lines, written in broken English and then Korean, because Minji's hands had been shaking too hard to stay in one language. She was sorry. She was so sorry. Minjun had asked about Janice twice since they got home. She didn't know how to explain to a 7-year-old boy why the woman who protected him had been taken away. Janice stared at the message for a long time. Then she typed back, "Just take care of Minjun. I'm going to be fine." She closed her phone, put on her coat, and went to the park. She needed air. She needed to think somewhere that wasn't surrounded by 6 years of evidence that her life here was fragile in ways she had refused to see clearly. She found a bench near a small pond, sat down, and looked up at the sky, which was doing that particular autumn thing where the light turned everything gold just before it disappeared. She didn't notice the black sedan parked at the edge of the path. She didn't notice it had been there for 11 minutes. And she didn't notice, until a shadow fell across the bench and she looked up, that Kang Ji-hoon was standing in front of her, under the falling autumn leaves, his hands in his coat pockets, watching her with an expression she couldn't immediately name. She stood up instinctively. "Chairman Kang." "Sit down, Miss Morgan," he said quietly. "Please." Something in the way he said please made her sit. He didn't sit beside her. He stood, which somehow made what he said next feel more serious, not less. "I know what happened to you this week," he said. "I know about the visa, I know about the footage going viral, and I know my GM fired you to protect a relationship worth more to him than your 6 years of work." Janice looked at him steadily. "If you're here to offer me my old position back as a PR gesture, I'm not." He said it before she could finish. I'm here to offer you something different. I want you to consult directly under me, rewrite our entire employee and guest relations protocol from the ground up. Fix the thing that allowed what happened to you, and to Min-ji, and to Min-jun, to happen at all. The offer landed somewhere unexpected in her chest. Why me? She said. Ji-hoon was quiet for a moment. When he spoke again, his voice had shifted, still controlled, but something underneath it had moved slightly, like furniture rearranged in a room you thought you knew. Because in 6 years, I have watched hundreds of employees pass through that hotel, he said. And in 6 years, you are the only one I have watched choose what was right over what was safe, every single time, without asking for anything in return. I need that person in the room when decisions are being made. Janice looked at him for a long moment. The gold light was fading. The park was getting cold. The contract, she said finally. Does it carry its own visa sponsorship? Independent of any department, he said. My legal team drafted it this morning. She almost smiled. Almost. You drafted it this morning, she said. Yes. Before you came to find me. Yes. That's not an investigation, she said. That's a decision. Ji-hoon said nothing, but something shifted at the corner of his mouth, so small it was almost invisible, and Janice Morgan picked up the contract, tucked it under her arm, and stood. I'll review it tonight, she said. And she walked away first, which was something almost no one ever did with Kang Ji-hoon. He watched her go. Behind him, somewhere near the sedan, Seo made a sound that was almost, a laugh. What followed over the next several weeks was not what either of them expected. Janice had anticipated a corporate arrangement, professional, structured, and emotionally neutral. She would do her work. He would approve her recommendations. They would fix the system. She would move on. But Kang Ji-hoon was not what she expected, and she was starting to understand that this was a problem. They worked late most evenings, going through years of employee files, guest complaint records, and internal protocols that had been quietly buried. And somewhere in those late evenings, between the documents and the cold coffee, and the arguments about how a real accountability system should function, she started to see him differently. There was the night she took him to a small African restaurant in a quiet neighborhood of Seoul, a place she had been coming to for years when the homesickness got too heavy to carry alone. She introduced him to jollof rice and watched his eyes water slightly at the heat, while he refused, absolutely refused, to admit he was struggling. She laughed, a real, unguarded laugh, and the sound surprised them both. There was the late walk where she tried to teach him a few phrases in Yoruba, her grandmother's language, the one she spoke only when she was tired or happy, or somewhere between the two. His pronunciation was so spectacularly wrong that even Ji-hoon, who had not genuinely laughed in longer than he could clearly remember, laughed. A warm, unrehearsed sound that made Seo, walking 20 paces behind them, stop walking entirely and stare. And there was the evening she came around the back of the hotel to collect a file and found Ji-hoon, Chairman Kang Ji-hoon, the man Seoul whispered about in careful voices, quietly carrying heavy grocery bags to a car for the elderly woman who ran the hotel laundry because she was struggling and no one else had noticed. Janice leaned against the wall and watched him. He didn't see her at first. So the terrifying chairman carries shopping bags, she said. Ji-hoon straightened and looked at her with an expression she was starting to recognize, the one he wore when he had been caught being human. Don't tell anyone, he said. She smiled. Too late. I've already told everyone. He looked at her. You haven't told anyone. No, she agreed, but I'm going to think about it constantly. He shook his head, but the corner of his mouth moved again. The thing happening between them didn't have a clean name. It wasn't dramatic. It didn't announce itself. It built the way warmth builds in a room that has been cold for a long time. Slowly, from the edges inward, until one day you realize you are no longer cold and you cannot pinpoint the exact moment it changed. One winter night, he took her to a hidden pojangmatcha near the river, a small tent restaurant, warmly lit, smelling of fish cake broth and charcoal, where they sat across from each other at a low table and shared odang from paper cups, while Soul's winter pressed itself against the canvas walls outside. She was telling him something about her grandmother, about the way the old woman used to say that a person's true character only revealed itself in moments when no one was watching. When Ji-hoon's phone rang. He answered. She watched his face. In the space of about 30 seconds, every trace of warmth drained out of it. He hung up. He looked at her across the small table with an expression she had never seen on him before. Not cold exactly, but tight. Like something was being held closed by force. "The socialite's family," he said. "They've purchased the media outlet that's been hosting the original ballroom video. They are going to release a new version. Edited." He paused. "They are targeting you directly, Janice." The tent felt suddenly smaller. The broth in her cup had stopped steaming. She looked at him across the table, and something in her, the part that had made that promise to herself in the quiet apartment, the part that had said, "Never again, never risk yourself again," went very still. And then, quietly, it let go. If you're feeling what we're all feeling right now, drop a comment below. Tell us what you think Janice is going to do. Like this video if this story is getting under your skin, because we are nowhere near finished yet. The next morning, Ji-hoon arrived at his office at 7 to find a hot coffee already sitting on his desk. Janice was standing at the window with her arms crossed, looking out at Seoul in the early gray light, and she spoke before he could. "They think they can intimidate us," she said. Not loudly, not dramatically, just with the same quiet certainty she had used in a ballroom full of frozen people. "They don't know who they're dealing with. We fight this together." Ji-hoon stood in the doorway and looked at her for a long moment. In his world, the world beneath the world, the one that ran on fear and leverage and the careful management of other people's secrets, he had never once had someone stand beside him without a reason that was ultimately about themselves. Everyone who stayed close to Kang Ji-hoon stayed because of what he could do for them, or because of what he might do to them if they left. That was the entire architecture of his life. Janice Morgan was standing at his window because she thought it was right. That evening, he took her to a quiet overlook high above the city. Seoul spread itself below them in every direction, 10 million lights in 10 million windows, the Han River a dark ribbon cutting through it all. And Ji-hoon, who had spent his entire adult life building walls that nobody could see and nobody could scale, stood beside her and felt every single one of them become irrelevant. "I have spent my entire life," he said slowly, "surrounded by people who respected my power." He looked at her. "You are the first person who made me want to deserve it." Janice turned toward him. "I thought you'd never ask," she said softly. And he kissed her against the backdrop of 10 million lights, in the kind of silence that only exists between two people who have both been alone for a very long time. They had exactly one night of that feeling. One night before the socialite and the acting GM released their version of the ballroom video. A deep fake, seamlessly edited, showing Janice violently shoving the socialite in what appeared to be an unprovoked attack. One night before the GM arranged for a diamond necklace worth $40,000 to be placed quietly in Janice's consulting locker. One night before someone made a phone call to the authorities. Janice walked into the hotel lobby the following morning and stopped. 2 officers, a pair of handcuffs catching the light. The acting GM stood just behind them, his hands folded, wearing the smile of a man who had been waiting a very long time to arrive at this exact moment. The holding cell was cold in the specific way of places that are designed to make you feel small. Janice sat on the metal bench, her back straight, her hands folded in her lap, and she did not confess. She did not explain. She did not perform distress for the officers who checked on her at intervals. She simply waited, and she thought. She thought about a decision she had made 3 months ago, quiet, almost instinctive, born from a low-grade unease she had never been able to fully name. She had been watching the acting GM for weeks by then, noticing the small erasures, guest complaints that disappeared from the system overnight, promotion evaluations that came back inexplicably altered, records that should have existed that simply did not. She hadn't known exactly what she was looking at, but she had backed up everything she could access onto a personal cloud drive, just in case. From the holding cell, she called her lawyer and gave her exactly one instruction: Access the drive. Print everything. Meanwhile, on the other side of the city, in a parking garage lit by a single flickering fluorescent tube, Kang Ji-hoon had a quiet conversation with the tech expert who had built the deepfake. Ji-hoon didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. He set a single folder on the hood of the man's car, a folder containing documentation of illegal activity that made the deepfake look like a minor inconvenience by comparison, and he looked at the man with eyes that contained absolutely nothing warm. "You have 1 hour," he said. "Restore the original footage, write a full confession, or the police will be the safest place you could possibly be tonight." The man's hands shook so badly he could barely open the folder. When Janice walked out of the precinct 2 hours later, Ji-hoon was waiting at the bottom of the steps. He looked at her without speaking. She looked back at him. "I have everything," she said. "So do I," he said. They stood there in the cold night air, and both of them understood simultaneously that they were no longer defending themselves. They were building a trap. The acting GM called an emergency board meeting the next morning with total confidence. He had bought 2 board members. He had the public narrative. He had the fake footage, or so he believed. He walked into that boardroom ready to end Kang Ji-hoon's chairmanship and permanently close the door on Janice Morgan. Ji-hoon and Janice arrived together. At the door, Seo stepped close and lowered his voice. "Boss, the socialite's family moved faster than we expected. Both purchased board members are already inside. If they call the vote before you present." Ji-hoon looked at him. "They bought 2? "Yes." Ji-hoon straightened his jacket. "Let's show them who actually owns the bank." They walked in. The GM saw them, and something flickered across his face. A brief, involuntary thing, before his smile reassembled itself. The purchased board members immediately called for a vote. The GM clasped his hands on the table with the calm of a man holding a hand he was certain could not be beaten. "You have no proof to contest this decision, Chairman Kang," he said. Janice quietly opened her laptop. "Actually," she said, "we do." She plugged in. The projector screen filled with the hotel's own internal records, years of them, organized and time-stamped and cross-referenced, promotion records that had been manually altered, guest complaints that had been deleted, and most devastatingly, a complete payment history showing exactly how much money had moved from the socialite's family accounts into the GM's private offshore holdings over a 4-year period. The room went completely silent. Ji-hoon stood beside her with his arms crossed, and he did not say a single word, because Janice Morgan did not need him to. She walked that room through the evidence with the precise, unhurried calm of someone who had been underestimated her entire career and had quietly been preparing for this moment without ever knowing it. The GM's face had gone the color of old paper. He pushed his chair back, slowly, carefully, as though movement might help him find an exit that wasn't there. The boardroom doors opened behind him. The officers who stepped through were the same ones who had put handcuffs on Janice Morgan that morning. The GM looked at Janice, one last time, and even now, cornered and finished and fully understood, his voice carried the old contempt. "You think you won? Hotels aren't built on fairness, Miss Morgan." Ji-hoon stepped forward. He looked down at the man with the absolute, unhurried calm of someone who has never needed volume to be the most dangerous person in any room. "No," he said quietly. "They are built on the people who make our guests feel safe, and you are no longer welcome in mine." The doors closed behind the GM. The purchased board members quietly found reasons to study the table. The socialite's family, when the full documentation went public 48 hours later, issued a statement disowning her actions so rapidly that the ink was practically still wet. Her carefully curated reputation didn't survive the week. Before we reach the end of this story, if you've stayed with us this far, you know exactly why we do this. Subscribe to this channel, and like the video if you've enjoyed it so far. Months later, the Kang Grand Hotel had a new director of guest experience. She arrived on her first official morning, not through the service entrance, not through the staff corridor, but through the main lobby doors. The same doors she had walked out of with her badge on a desk and her dignity entirely intact, and which she now walked back through with her name on a contract and a mandate to change everything. Her first act was the Morgan policy, not named by her, named by Ji-hoon, who had submitted the paperwork himself, quietly, without mentioning it to her until she saw it in print. A legally binding employee protection protocol that made it impossible for any worker at any level to be dismissed or mistreated without a full, independent investigation. No exceptions, no purchasing your way around it. That evening, Ji-hoon gathered his trusted inner circle, Seo, a few others, Min-ji, who had been quietly promoted to evening shift supervisor 3 weeks prior, in a warm private room with food and no agenda except the simple, underrated act of being somewhere good together. Seo raised his glass. "Boss," he said, smiling the smile of a man who had been waiting years to say something like this. "I have watched you win wars. I have never once seen you this happy." Ji-hoon looked across the room at Janice, who was laughing at something Min-ji had just said, and he said nothing. He didn't need to. The answer was obvious to everyone in the room. Later, as they crossed the grand lobby together, the same lobby where everything had started, a small figure came running across the marble floor. Min-jun, 7 years old, wearing a jacket that actually fit him now, holding something carefully in both hands. He stopped in front of Janice and held it out. A drawing, done in crayon, slightly crumpled at one corner from being carried so seriously. 3 figures, holding hands, 2 women, and a tall man in a suit. At the top, in the careful, uneven handwriting of a child who had worked very hard on every letter. "Thank you for protecting me." Janice knelt and pulled him into her arms without a word, and Min-ji stood a few steps away with her hand pressed to her mouth, and the lobby, this enormous, marble, chandelier-lit lobby that had witnessed so much, held that moment quietly. Ji-hoon reached down and took Janice's hand as she stood. And then, from near the entrance, there was a sound. A glass, clinking against marble. A new employee, flustered, had bumped into an elegantly dressed guest. Everyone froze. The kind of freeze that lives in muscle memory, the instinctive brace for what comes next. The guest looked at the employee and smiled, waved her hand gently. The employee bowed. They both continued on their way. Janice looked around the lobby slowly, at the staff moving with confidence, at the guests being met as people, at the quiet, unremarkable, extraordinary ordinariness of a place that had learned, finally, genuinely, how to treat human beings like human beings. Ji-hoon leaned close. "Looks like your policy is already working." Janice squeezed his hand. "No, Ji-hoon," she said. "It's our policy." They walked out into the Seoul night together, not as chairman and consultant, not as powerful and powerless, not as any of the distances the world tries to place between people, but as 2 human beings who had found each other in the middle of a moment when one of them chose what was right over what was safe. And that, in the end, is always where the real story begins. Some people spend their entire lives waiting for someone in authority to give them permission to do the right thing. Janice Morgan never waited. She walked into the fire without armor and trusted that her integrity would be the only shield she needed. And she was right. Not because the world is always fair. It isn't. But because the people who refuse to become small, even when the world insists on it, are the ones who ultimately get to decide what the world looks like next. What was the one line from this story that stayed with you the most? Tell me in the comments. If you believe standing up for what's right is never the wrong choice, subscribe to the channel and share this story with someone who needs that reminder. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next story.